Hi, and welcome to my FlossTube video. I'm Jean Farish, and I am so glad that you're here with me today. I had to check my notes. We're actually up to number 12, so we're moving right along. Today, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of things. I'm going to bring you up to date with where I am on my own work in progress for the Jane Hattersley sampler. And I'm going to also chat a little bit about the ongoing stitch along that we have for Hearts Come Home at Christmas. We're going to talk about variegated threads, and I am finally going to show you how I wash and iron my cross stitch projects. And of course, we're going to do a couple FAQs as well. So let's start with Jane. I am pleased with what I have gotten done so far, but I found a mistake, and actually the mistake is not a stitching mistake, it's a charting error, and one that I have already fixed on my master chart. What we have on Jane across the bottom are these wonderful motifs. And you see that there are two fruit baskets. And after I designed one, I just automatically just copied and pasted it and put it on the other side of the sampler. And lo and behold, when I was putting together the Give Thanks freebie chart based on this motif, is when I realized that Sweet Jane threw me another curveball, in that she reversed the colors of the fruit in the basket on the second basket. So, and I didn't realize it until I was putting together the thing on my blog, and when I cropped the sampler to get that part of the original sampler for a photo on my blog, that's when I saw that I had stitched the colors backwards. And I thought, how did I do that? And that's when I realized that I was following the chart for the left-hand fruit basket, but I was showing on my blog the photo of the fruit basket on the right. So I fixed that on my blog post. And then, like I said, I went back to my master chart and have fixed that as well. But let me tell you why I'm not going to be ripping this out and fixing it. So the first thing to point out is how I stitched this. I was kind of working bottom up at this point. So I had stitched this checkerboard border and stitched the basket, and then I stitched this one row of green across here, where it's uninterrupted. And from there I was able to place the fruits accurately, correlating the position relative to the basket. So then after I did the 3 red fruits and the 3 neutral fruits, I then went back and filled in all the green. And knowing that is what becomes critical when you look at the back. So you can see when I was stitching the green, there are places where I buried the tail within the fruit, or like here where I was obviously stitching this area and went over to stitch this area and buried my thread between the already stitched fruit here. Same thing over here. And so what I realized when I started ripping these fruits out was that I was going to have an absolute mess. And I had to make decisions based on that. Now, let me tell you that if I were just strictly doing this for myself, I wouldn't even think about ripping it out. So I want to tell you that if you ended up doing the same thing, I would say, yeah, rip it out or don't rip it out. That's up to you. And if this were the sample that's being done, that's in the original sampler colors, that will be the featured photo for the chart pack when I get it done, then yes, I would be ripping it out and fixing it no matter how much, even if it meant ripping out the fruit as well as all the green leaves, because I really feel strongly that it's confusing to a stitcher if the photo doesn't match the chart. However, since this is kind of an extra, a way of showing how the colors can be kind of refreshed and what I'm calling the more contemporary color choices, then I didn't think that it's quite so compelling. It won't be on the cover, and I'll be able to have notes to say, okay, you may, those of you with an eagle eye are going to notice that here are some things that are different between the original reproduction or I should say, the reproduction of the original and this more contemporary sample. So that's my justification anyway, so it works for me. Next, I want to bring you up to date on where we are with the Hearts Come Home at Christmas stitch along. And it's important to know that this stitch along doesn't have any official start date. At any point in time, you can get started and jump in and join us. You can do it completely on your own. You can post your progress on Instagram and on Facebook by using the hashtag JFNSAL for Jean Dress Needlework Stitch Along. If you want to, that's completely up to you. I've learned a lot about my first kind of widespread stitch along. I've done them with smaller groups before, but this is the first time I've done it on such a large platform, and I've already learned a couple of things that I will do differently next time. One of them is to give shops a heads up that we're doing this so they can be prepared with inventory and maybe put together floss packs or whatever just to make it convenient for them and for you. So that's one big change that I'll make the next time I do something like this. But I am enjoying it so far. Many of you have already seen the first FlossTube upload that's labeled as Hearts Come Home at Christmas Part 1. And this is just an introduction, particularly aimed for the novice stitcher or anybody who's new or coming back to counted cross stitch. I cover things like choosing your fabric, making sure that the thread count of your fabric matches how it's labeled, how to figure out how large to cut your piece of fabric, some tips on floss storage, etc. So in that first one, I have not started stitching yet, but I am really itching to get my needle threaded and get started. So I'm again hoping to upload that next Wednesday. I apologize to those of you who were waiting for it this past Wednesday and it didn't happen. I had some technology issues that I had to get resolved, and finally did a day late, but it's there now. So look for that. And I'm trying to think what else I need to tell you, particularly about that stitch along. I am absolutely loving the colors. When I got them all on my thread drops and started just looking at the way they relate to each other, I am just really, really thrilled with that. Also, a reminder that because this one is 100% cross stitch, that it can be done on any fabric that's made for cross stitch, from Aida to even weaves to linens. I will be stitching it on linen over 2. I'm not going to give instructions on stitching over 1. Those of you who are already familiar with that process are more than welcome to do so, but it's not going to be part of the video instructions that I'll be giving. When I get to the quote on Hearts Come Home at Christmas, I'm planning on using one of the Cosmo variegated flosses. And I'm also going to use a variegated for the vine within the circular sampler border. So in thinking about that is one of the reasons I figured that today would be a good day to talk about variegateds in general, because they do need to be handled differently. And when I talk about variegateds, I'm talking about any floss that is deliberately either a subtle change in color within the strand, or a more obvious coloration in the strand, or it can be even where several different colors are combined within a strand. So it's really, everything I'm going to talk about now can be applied to anything other than the solids. So I guess that's a better way of saying it. So this is not brand specific. I'm going to be using Cosmo because that's what I happen to have on hand. And I would love to introduce to you their seasons, what they call their seasons, which is their variegated lines. And they actually have 3 different lines, which is kind of interesting. So let me grab my skeins of floss and a piece of fabric, and I'll get right back to you. I'm going to interrupt my my presentation here for just a moment, and I feel like I can do this because of the informality of FlossTube videos, but I am experiencing the same technology challenges that I experienced in trying to make part 1 of the stitch along videos, and that is that my close-up camera keeps shutting down without me knowing it until I go into edit, and then I realize that what should have been 5 or 10 minutes of video that's close-up of the work I'm trying to show you is just not there. It's like if it's an 8-minute segment, I might have the first 3 minutes that got saved, and then my camera just shut off. So, and I don't know it because it's just silent, and I'm not watching. There's no way for me to see what's going on with the camera until I'm done. And it just happened again in the middle of trying to explain to you about how the variegateds are handled differently and how I handle them differently on the thread drops. So I tell you all this to tell you that if today's broadcast or episode, whatever you want to call it, it's not technically a broadcast, you know what I mean. If today's episode seems a little choppier than normal, just bear with me, because that's what's going on, and it's frustrating. And I'm trying to find creative solutions as I'm going along, and that it is what it is. So just let me see if I can figure out where it got caught off and pick up from there. Basically what I'm talking about, and again, this is my system for the thread drops, but what I'm talking about applies whether you're using bobbins or bags or whatever. And that is that you can't just take, in stitching with 2 strands, you can't just randomly take 2 strands and put them together and start stitching. So therefore, what I've shown you before, how I can take a needle and just pick up 1 strand and pull it off my thread drop, that doesn't work for this. So what I have to do is, I need to put on my close-up glasses for one thing so that I can see what I'm talking about. What I have to do, let me see if I can get this close-up camera to work now. So what I have to do is to take an entire set of 6 strands off the thread drop. Now I'm going to set this all aside and just work with this 1 set of 6 strands. Now, I keep my strands long on my thread drops because I'm stitching with the loop method. And so when I start with a 30-inch length, when I start stitching, I'm actually stitching with 15 inches. But I can't use the loop method with variegated. So I'm going to cut this 30-inch piece in half. And now I have 2 15-inch lengths. And I'm going to set one of those aside. And I'm just going to deal with this 1 15-inch length of the 6 strands. Now, many of you know that you can tap the end of the 6-strand grouping to get them separated. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to hold this kind of by what I call the throat, just kind of hold it right there, not real firmly, and I can just pull a strand out. And now I have to know that I'm going to lay this out so I know this is the top, okay? And now I'm going to grab a second strand and lay it with the first one in the same order. So now here I have the 4 strands I'm not using, but I'm going to keep those together and just set those aside for right now. So now these are the 2 that I'm going to be stitching with. And it's important to make sure that they're laying in the same direction and that they're even at the end. And now what I'm going to do is dampen it like I normally do with my sponge. And I gave more details about why I do this on an earlier video, so I'm not going to go into that now. But I'm going to dampen this, and you can see how much it straightens it out. And now I'm ready to stitch. Good, I got through that whole segment without the camera stopping, so that's good. I try to follow the when life gives you lemons, make lemonade philosophy. And what I've realized, and having to constantly go back and check and make sure that my close-up camera has captured what I think it should, I realized that when I start stitching my samples, you will see the effect better if I choose a color that is not quite so subtle. And so I'm kind of taking this out of the order I had planned on doing it. And so right now what I want to do is jump to some of the more colorful choices within the Cosmo line. So then when I start stitching, it will make sense, I think. We'll see. Okay, so let me get set up. As I mentioned, Cosmo actually has 3 groupings of their variegated: the 5,000 line, the 8,000 line, and the 9,000 line. The 5,000 line, the colors, even when they are a dramatic difference like this one, which I pulled out for all my beach-loving friends that might like these colors. You know who I'm talking about here. Or a more subtle one, or one that's kind of in between. What they all have in common is that the colors that are used in the variation pattern are evenly distributed. So every 8 centimeters, the color changes, and the color is changing evenly. So that if you've got, say, an orange, a yellow, a green, and a blue like this one, the color distribution is going to be equal. Same thing with the more subtle one. In the 8,000 line, the color gradation is gentler. It's more subtle. And then in the 9,000 line, what we have is the color distribution is not even. One color length will be longer and the next one will be shorter. So let me set these aside. And I think I'm going to stitch with this one as my sample. So when I pull this out, and I love how it's very, very obvious which end to pull out. So I'm going to pull out quite a long length here so that you can see how the color, I'm going to come in closer, so you can see how the color is changing and not necessarily evenly. Like here's a little tiny speck of red, and then it's bracketed by a longer length of lime green and turquoise. So that just describes a little bit about these lines. So I'm going to cut off a 15 or 16 inch length here and get going. As luck would have it, the piece of floss that I cut has 2 very distinctly different colors on the end, so it's very easy to see what I'm showing you here. So I'm going to tap the end of this to loosen it up some, and I'm just grabbing one single strand, and by holding on to the whole 6 strands right here firmly but not too tightly, I can pull the strand out. Now, again, because the colors are so distinct, I'll know which end is which, but do discipline yourself to lay down the strand so that you know which end is which. So there's my first strand, and now I'm pulling out my second strand. And I'm gonna, here's the 4 strands that are left, and I'm just gonna set those aside to use later. So these 2 strands are identical in the way the colors are arranged. And I'm making sure that I'm lining them up on this end. And as per usual, I'm going to dampen the strands. So now I need to thread my needle. And now I'm ready to stitch. Now, because I can't start with the loop method, I'm going to put a knot in this end. This is what we call a waist knot. It's going to be wasted. It's going to be cut off later. Now, the first method I'm going to show you is going to be using the traditional Danish method of half cross over and half cross back. So let's see what happens when I do it in that method. So the waist knot goes in the front of your fabric, a couple of inches away from where you intend to start stitching. And it's just going to rest there until we no longer need it. So I'm going to start right here. And I'm going to take about 5 half cross stitches. Now I've got one finger on the back of, whoops, dropped my needle. I've got one finger on the back here that I can tell by feel that I'm catching this thread, this tail on the back. So let's take a look. So do, if in doubt, check and make sure that you're catching the tail with your first stitches. And you can see this color is already changing from the navy blue or sailor blue to a little bit of yellow and now red. And I think one more stitch, now I can get rid of my waist knot. We call it a buried waist knot because it's being buried as we're stitching. Now I like to cut it off from the back. So don't wait. In fact, I waited a little bit, probably did 1 stitch too many. Make sure you've got enough room here to be able to get your scissors under that thread. And when you can see both tips of your scissors, you know that you're not going to be accidentally cutting the wrong thing. Cut that off. And now I'm wasting the knot. And I'm totally done with that. Now, there are probably some times in a design that you may like this this look. But when you hear people say you can't stitch in the traditional way with variegateds, this is why. Just as I did with the first sample, I have threaded the turquoise into the eye of my needle and put the knot on the navy blue end. And now I'm going to do complete cross stitches. I'm still catching the tail on the back with my first stitches. So now I have my red half cross being crossed by another red half cross. Before I cross that stitch, I'm going to park my needle here for a second. Turn this over. Oops. And cut off the waist knot. So you can already see how different the two rows are just with that little bit of a sample and using the exact same two strands. And in case you're wondering, this is what it looks like on the back. Every time people talk about variegateds and overdyed flosses, what always comes up is the issue of whether or not they are color fast. And if they are not color fast, then they cannot be washed. And if they cannot be washed, they cannot be ironed. So I'm going to start right there and tell you that whenever you apply heat to anything that is not clean, you are setting whatever oils or stains or whatever are in the piece. And they may not be visible to you right now. They may not be visible for 10 or 20 years. And for many of you, you might think, well, who cares 20 years from now? And if it's, you know, if it's a little tiny piece of no great consequence to you, then yeah, I kind of get that. But if you've been working for months on a larger piece, what you are thinking of as being an heirloom piece, then it does make a difference. So what do we do about threads that we don't know are color fast if indeed what we want to do is wash and iron them? Now today I'm not going to get into arguments about pros and cons of washing and ironing your cross stitch, but I'm just going to go on record right here and say I have washed and ironed every piece of cross stitch I have ever done, personally or professionally, for decades. And in fact, the piece behind you, America Land That We Love, I actually stitched that over a span of 4 or 5 years. So yes, I actually washed it before I finished it. That piece was probably washed a half a dozen times at least. Because I mean, if it started feeling not grungy, but you know, it's not crisp anymore, then I washed and ironed it before I went on stitching it, and it's fine. You know, it's like washing and ironing a favorite blouse or shirt or whatever. So I'm going to actually show you what process I use. And I'm going to use my work in progress, my Jane Hattersley sampler, because I have been working on it now for a couple of months, and I'm feeling like it needs to be spruced up a little bit. So what do you do about your variegateds that you're not sure of, or you are sure they're not color fast? Now again, keep in mind, I am telling you what I would do. I would wash the floss before I started stitching. I'm not going to stitch with anything that I don't feel is color fast. I'm not going to take the chance with my work. Now, your major brands and even reds, I will go on record right now and tell you that in all my years of stitching with DMC, over 40 years of professionally stitching with DMC until I recently started using Cosmo, I have never had even the deepest or brightest red bleed on my work. Now, I use cool to tepid water. And in case you don't know what tepid means, it means it's not hot and it's not cold. It's sort of like room temperature. It's like sort of in that no man's land of, it's like not having a temperature almost. It's tepid. And I'll be showing you that in just a minute when we go upstairs to my kitchen sink and I demonstrate how I wash and iron. So just to clarify and to kind of conclude what I'm saying here is, if you are in doubt, check. But you can pretty much rely that if you wash it properly and with the right soap, you're not going to have a problem. Now, I'll also go on record as saying Woolite is made for wool. It doesn't matter that it says it's made for hand washables. Okay, I would not use Woolite on my 100% cotton floss. I think that's asking for trouble. And I wonder if some of the disasters that people have had with red floss have been because of whatever they have used in the washing process. Now, you also probably have read comments that people have made about a relatively new product called Color Catchers and how they have used it to keep colors from bleeding. I have not used them yet. I did buy some because my daughter has a Lizzie Kate design that she stitched with some overdyed flosses, and she wants to wash it. And I said, let's get Color Catchers and use them when we wash that. So that'll be another episode. So for right now, so what do you do if in doubt? Well, you need to dampen the floss and then put it between white paper towels. And if no color comes off, you're fine. If color comes off, then there are some steps you need to take. And frankly, today's not the day for me to get into that. This episode will get way too long. So what I'm about to share with you is what I do when I know that my threads are color fast, how I wash them and iron them. So let's go upstairs. Let's see how this is going to work out, because I've got the camera in one hand and I'm trying to do the washing and ironing with the other hand. So this is really a voiceover, a narration after the fact. So I just put my finger in a jar of Orvis soap, and it really only takes a drop. So that's why I just stick my finger in there, and that's a gracious plenty for what I need to do just for this little basin. I started with warm water because I feel like it helps the soap get activated better. And then I immediately switched to cold water, so I end up with a tepid temperature. Now, as I'm washing it, all I'm doing is swishing it around. I am doing my best not to add any wrinkles to it. So when I go to rinse it, I'm going to not wring it at all. In just a minute, you're going to notice that I find a needle in the bottom of my basin. So I would suggest that before you start, that one of the first things to do is check and make sure you don't have any needles in your work. I feel very fortunate that I found that one, because it certainly would have caused a problem with the garbage disposal. So I'm now rinsing it under cool water. And again, I'm not wringing it at all, because I don't want to add any, here's that needle. I don't want to add any wrinkles to the work. Now, before I started, I laid a small towel out on the counter, and I'm just going to pick this up dripping wet and lay it right on the towel. And again, understand I'm doing this one-handed, so it's a little awkward. But I'm just going to lay it out flat on the towel. Make sure I'm not adding any wrinkles, because what I'm going to do now is to roll it up in this towel. And I'm basically doing this so that I won't be dripping water across the kitchen floor as I take this over to the ironing board. Before I started the washing process, I had my ironing board set up with a layer of 4 terry towels. Basically, it's 2 terry towels that are each folded in half, so I have 4 layers. I have used as many as 6 layers at a time, and I recommend anywhere between that 4 and 6 number to make sure you have a really nice thick cushion between your piece and the hard surface of the ironing board. I also set my iron's temperature to the linen setting, because I am stitching on linen. Now, if you're stitching on one of the even weave fabrics, then you need to make sure that you're not setting your iron too high, because your man-made fibers are not going to take as warm a temperature as linen or 100% cotton would. Now you're seeing a little bit of steam, but my iron is actually set on the dry setting. You're seeing the steam because my hot iron is coming in contact with the wet fabric. So I wouldn't say it was dripping wet, but it was pretty wet, because all I did was loosely roll it up in that other smaller towel to carry it over to the ironing board. Notice that I am pretty much keeping my iron in constant motion. Do not let it rest for any length of time in one spot, or you're going to end up scorching it. You'll also notice I'm not using a pressing cloth. Now, my stitches are pretty tight, so I don't really see any need for a pressing cloth. But if I had loose stitches on the back, then I definitely would be using a pressing cloth. Also keep in mind that I stitched with 100% cotton floss. I did not use any metallics. I don't have any buttons or beads. So this is what I do when I have strictly cross stitch that's being that was stitched with 100% cotton floss. Once you feel like the piece is pretty much dry, then if you just carefully peel back the corner, the interesting thing is that you'll see an impression of your stitches on the towel. Now, unfortunately, trying to do this one-handed, I didn't get quite as distinct image as I have at other times. But you can usually actually see the sampler impressed on the terry towel. I gently moved the sampler so that I can now iron the other half of it, and just continue following the same process. And I just keep ironing until I feel like it's pretty much dry. Once I do feel like it's dry, I'm going to hang it on a skirt hanger. By letting it air dry overnight, I prevent adding wrinkles to it when I either stitch it, or if I'm completely finished with the project and I'm ready to pin it or lace it to foam core, then I know I'm not going to be accidentally adding any wrinkles to the piece. I want to end today's episode with a couple of questions that have come in. And one of them is from V, that she just used her initial V. She said, why do we want to keep the backs of our projects neat? Is it for framing purposes? And the answer to that is sort of yes and no. The answer that I gave her and that I will share with you now is that the effort is not to keep the back neat. The effort is to keep the front looking as good as you can possibly get it to look. And when you do, the result is that the back will look good. As a teacher, I very often look at the back of my students' work because it tells me how they executed the stitch, and it alerts me to possible solutions if I see a problem on the front. So I'm not looking as any sort of judging thing. It's more diagnostic, let's call it. And that's what I do in a classroom setting. Looking at the back of your work will give you clues about what's going on the front. So that's why the back is neat, is a movement. And I will just tell you, it's like fingernails on a chalkboard to me. Man, that's an old-fashioned term. Nobody uses chalkboards anymore. How are we going to describe that creepy feeling that we get when something doesn't sit right with us? Because when people say there are no rules in cross stitch, it just really gets me, because it's not a matter of rules. It's a matter of best practices. This is what you do in order to do a good job. Now, if a good job isn't your goal, then fine. But don't go on Facebook and say to a beginner, there are no rules. Now, if you want to say there are no best practices, that's what you're saying when you say there are no rules. Okay, so I said I would be answering questions, and I only did one, so there is no questions plural. But I think that that's pretty much a wrap. This has probably gone longer than my usual FlossTube episodes, but I've enjoyed it, and I hope that you have too. And the important thing is stitch happy and stay safe. I'll see you next week.